This is Newgate Prison, probably the most notorious building in the history of London. It stood for almost 800 years, and throughout its long and troubled existence, became the quintessential symbol of death and suffering in the city, and was considered, almost literally, as a gateway into hell. This is the story of London's worst prison. In 1156, King Henry II decreed that a jail or prison for felons and trespassers should be constructed at Newgate, a gatehouse on the western side of the Roman walls that demarcated the ancient boundaries of the city. Early records indicate that it quickly acquired its negative reputation. 64 prisoners died there in an epidemic of Gaol-Fever in 1419, prompting the Mayor of London to explain that, by reasons of the fetid and corrupt atmosphere in the heinous jail of Newgate, many persons are now dead. Later, in 1537, 8 Carthusian monks were starved to death in the prison, on account of their religious dissent. This fate became an unpleasantly common feature of Newgate life, so much so that Edward III ordered the temporary evacuation of Newgate because the jail is so full of prisoners that they are continually dying of hunger and oppression. The suffering at Newgate in this period took on a mythical quality, embodied in the story of the Black Dog of Newgate. This was a walking spirit in the likeness of a black dog, seen gliding up and down the streets a little before the time of execution. In 1666, great fire swept through London, wiping out the topography of the old city. From its ashes, new buildings emerged, amongst these Newgate, redesigned in 1672 by Sir Christopher Wren, in a design described as possessing great magnificence. While the layout of Newgate Prison could be altered, its essential character was not so easily exercised. The prison quickly reverted to a familiar state of chaos and contagion. One inmate from the period described Newgate variously as a dismal prison, a place of calamity, a habitation of misery, and a bottomless pit of violence. Contemporary plans reveal the layout of Newgate at this time. The prison was divided into 3 main areas: the felons' prison for ordinary criminals, the debtors' prison, housing those unable to pay their debts, and the press yard, used to detain political or religious dissenters. Each area contained a central courtyard, and around these 5 stories of cells. The typical cell in Newgate was a large and overcrowded stone room. There were no beds, and food was, of the poorest quality, served in the smallest portions. Despite the dismal conditions inside Newgate, inmates did enjoy a certain degree of liberty. They mixed and socialised with one another, played cards, gambled, kept various animals, cats, dogs, pigs and pigeons. There was a chapel in the centre of the prison where prisoners could pray and attend religious services. Ironically, this neighboured a drinking cellar, where inmates consumed strong forms of home-brewed gin with names like Kill Grief, Comfort and Poverty. One prisoner recalled of the drinking cellar that such wretchedness abounds there that the place has the exact aspect of hell itself. The pestilence contained within Newgate pervaded the entire local area. Pedestrians in passing the gateway held their noses, and citizens might be doused with the contents of a chamber pot. In 1750, a typhus epidemic in the prison spread to the nearby courtrooms at the Old Bailey, wherein the Lord Mayor, 2 of the judges, and 1 of the aldermen upon the bench were seized with a malignant fever and died. In response, the authorities installed a windmill on the top of the central gate, designed to dispel the miasma of noxious air that emanated from the prison. We can only imagine that the windmill did little to stop the spread of disease, with periodic outbreaks continuing throughout the rest of the 18th century. The central authority in the building was the keeper of Newgate, who resided in a house adjacent to the main entrance. On the ground, the prison was managed by jailers. Ostensibly, their role was to maintain order and prevent escape. In reality, the jailers at Newgate were concerned primarily with the extortion of money from inmates. They confiscated gifts for prisoners, stole food rations and resold them at inflated prices. They charged prisoners a fee for easement or the loosening of tight shackles. They were generally regarded as a merciless race of men, and, by being conversant with scenes of misery, steeled against any tender sensation. What little comfort could be bought in Newgate was afforded on the basis of altitude. Cells in the upper parts of the prison were occupied by masters. These prisoners were able to pay a premium to improve their stay, granting them access to more spacious individual cells, as well as other luxuries like cooked food, tobacco, and coal. Conversely, the darkest and most despondent areas of the prison were the subterranean cells. These were located in the condemned hold underneath the keeper's house, and reserved specifically for prisoners awaiting execution. The cells were described as being full of horrors, without light, and swarming with vermin and creeping things. An open sewer ran through the middle of the chamber. Here prisoners would await the day of their execution, the evening before which a church official would visit the cells and recite what was known as the Newgate Prayer. All ye that in the condemned hold do lie, prepare ye, for tomorrow you shall die. Watch all and pray, the hour is drawing near, that ye before Almighty God shall appear. For those consigned to the condemned hold, their only hope was escape. The most famous example of this was Jack Sheppard, a notorious thief who had already broken out of 2 of London's prisons by the spring of 1724. He was reapprehended in August and found himself in Newgate's condemned hold awaiting execution. He managed to smuggle in with him a sharp implement described as a spike, which he used to gradually carve an opening onto the outside road. Once finished, he was pulled out of the dungeon by accomplices and disappeared into the busy London streets. Sheppard spent the next few days on a robbing spree before being recaptured and returned to Newgate. This time he was locked in a secure castle on the 5th story, where his hands were cuffed and his legs chained to the floor. While incarcerated, he reportedly told one visitor, "Yes, sir, I am the Sheppard, and all the jailers in town are my flock." Once again, he miraculously escaped. Slipping his hands through the handcuffs, he pulled a nail from the doorframe, which he used to spring the chains about his legs. He then climbed out of the cell and into the adjacent room. He picked the door inside and made his way onto the roof. From here, Sheppard climbed down the outer walls and once again slipped anonymously into the city. Sheppard's friends and family begged him to leave London, but he could not bring himself to abandon his city of birth. He was recaptured just 2 weeks later and readmitted to Newgate, where he was kept under constant surveillance. There were rumours that he would engineer an escape or break away on the morning of his execution. But this time, Newgate proved impregnable. Jack Sheppard was hanged on the 16th of November, 1724. Nevertheless, his legacy persisted. Sheppard's exploits made him a hero in the eyes of the people, an emblem of resistance against punitive institutions like Newgate. One commentator noted that children in London have never heard the name of Her Majesty nor St. Paul or Moses, but there was a general knowledge of the character and course of life of Jack Sheppard, the robber and prison breaker. The popular animosity felt towards Newgate became most apparent in 1780, when the Gordon riots erupted throughout London. Initially motivated by anti-Catholic sentiment, the riots evolved into a wider conflagration against symbols of authority and power. Rioters set fire to the houses of politicians, attacked the Bank of England, and on the 2nd of June, tore down the door to Newgate Prison, liberated its inhabitants, and burned the building to the ground. This was the second time that Newgate had been consumed by fire, and once again it would rise from its ashes. The construction of the prison, based on new designs by George Dance, was finished in 1782. Over the next century, the traditional chaos of Newgate was slowly replaced. During the Victorian era, prisons were now viewed as a means of rehabilitation, designed to reform inmates rather than brutalise them. In practice, this meant a centralised and bureaucratic system of administration: uniforms, individual cells, set times for meals and exercise. Still, the fundamental spirit of Newgate endured. Charles Dickens, the great chronicler of Victorian life, described the building in 1836 as a gloomy depository of the guilt and misery of London, containing a throng of wretched creatures pent up within. This sense of despair was similarly captured by Gustave Doré in his 1872 engraving entitled Newgate Exercise Yard. We see the steep oppressive walls of the prison, which seem to block out all sunlight, producing a pit of darkness in which weary-looking inmates are forced to trudge around in circles. The analogy of Newgate as a kind of hell thereby persisted. By 1902, Newgate Prison was no longer needed, having been replaced by the capital's newer institutions of criminal justice. Somewhere like Newgate, with its legacy of brutality and disregard for human suffering, had no place in the modern world. The people of London did not mourn its passing. There are no monuments or sites dedicated to the ancient prison. Only in the name of the street where it once stood can Newgate's long and troubled history be detected.